Hello and welcome back to Bookish. This is the third installment of the Faulkner in August, Light in August read-along. In this installment I'm going to be talking about chapters 7 through 11. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Yes, those 5 chapters I'm going to be talking about. But before I do that, I want to read a passage from Faulkner from chapter 6, which I intended to read as a part of my last video, and I just want to read it today because I think there's something really kind of inherently Faulkner-esque about this passage. Memory believes before knowing remembers, believes longer than recollects, longer than knowing even wonders. Knows, remembers, believes a corridor in a big, long, garbled, cold, echoing building of dark red brick, soot bleakened by more chimneys than its own, set in a grassless, cinder-strewn packed compound, surrounded by smoking factory purlieus, and enclosed by a 10-foot steel and wire fence like a penitentiary or a zoo, where in random erratic surges with sparrow-like child-trebling orphans in identical and in uniform blue denim in and out of remembering, but in knowing constant as the bleak walls, the bleak windows, wherein rained soot from the yearly adjacent chimneys streaked like black tears. So that is an incredibly long William Faulkner sentence, and there is beauty in it, and there is confusion in it, and there is symbolism in it. And I just wanted to read that to you because I forgot to do it last time, and I really like that sentence. So chapters 7 through 11 are really all about Joe Christmas. You know, we met Joe Christmas in the first 6 chapters. We know that he is a rough individual with tendency towards violence. We know that he has now been accused of murdering a white woman named Joanna Burden by Joe Brown, who we also know as Lucas Birch, the father of Lena Grove's child. We know that he was preparing to escape or to leave the area of Jefferson where all this story takes place, and we know that he grew up in an orphanage from which he was eventually adopted by a childless man and woman. And in chapters 7 through 11 we get to see Joe Christmas grow up. We first see him in the home of the McEachran family. This is the man and the woman who adopted him. They are strict Presbyterians. Mr. McEachran is a violent, stubborn, self-possessed, incredibly confident, sure he's right about everything, you know, man with almost no sympathy at all, he lacks kind of basic ideas of human kindness. He viciously beats Joe as a young boy because he can't learn his catechism. He treats Joe essentially as a worker on the farm, in which he uses him almost like slave labor. It's an important thing to keep in mind there, that Joe works hard on the farm and he is regularly beaten by Mr. McEachran. His father figure, we know that Joe's adoptive mother, Mrs. McEachran, is not necessarily always supportive of Mr. McEachran's behavior towards Joe, and she attempts to help him, to nurture him, to coddle him, to make life easier for him. And one of the most telling things about this is that Joe resents Mrs. McEachran more than he resents his father. And she helps to shape some of his ideas about women in general. With Mr. McEachran, he says he understands him. He knows what's going to happen. He's predictable. You know, yes, he's vicious and violent and cruel, but, you know, at least Joe knows what to expect. With Mrs. McEachran, he always feels like she is secretive and furtive and capricious and, you know, always wanting to break the rules almost just so that Mr. McEachran can find out and Joe can be in more trouble. And he trusts the violence and the cruelty of Mr. McEachran more than he trusts the tenderness of Mrs. McEachran. And I think that's an important thing to understand about Joe Christmas. He also, I think, really resents religion, and we know that he resents being prayed over. He rebels against the McEachran household and values. There is a disturbing scene in which he and 5 other boys have essentially, I guess, hired a young African American girl to be a prostitute for all 5 of them, and Joe, rather than having sex with her, viciously beats her and gets into a fight with everybody else. When he's in a situation where he feels uncomfortable and he doesn't know what to do, he responds violently. We'll see this again. Joe is increasingly rebellious against Mr. McEachran. He begins stealing money. Or against Mr. McEachran, he begins stealing money from Mrs. McEachran. He starts sneaking out at night to go to what he thinks is a restaurant to meet with a waitress named Bobby, and he ends up falling in love with Bobby and becoming her lover, only to find out that in reality she is a prostitute. When he finds out she's a prostitute and that his kind of love ideal isn't what he thought, he turns to a life of smoking and drinking and hanging out in the restaurant, which we now know is really just a front for a brothel in which Bobby is the only prostitute. Despite this, he continues to sneak out to meet with her, and he continues to give her money. When Mr. McEachran learns of this, he follows Joe and Bobby to a dance hall. He confronts Bobby, he calls her a harlot and a Jezebel, and Joe responds by killing him, by hitting him with a chair and saying, "I told you I was going to do it, all along." So he's killed his father figure. He goes back to the house to collect his money and his things because he plans to run away with Bobby. When he goes back to the restaurant brothel to meet with, to pick up Bobby and to take her away with him, he is confronted by the owner of the restaurant and his wife and another man who clearly are just running a house of prostitution, which now Joe is messed up because he's involved their prostitute in a murder, and they're planning on getting out. Joe is rejected by Bobby, who he had told that he was of mixed race, who calls him the N-word and says she can't believe she gave away, her kind of money-making deal on a mixed race person. He's beaten, he's robbed. Oddly, the wife of the man who owns the restaurant brothel insists on leaving Joe with some money. So he does have some money, and with that money, he escapes, and for, I think it says 15 years, he lives life on the road, traveling all over the country, sometimes with lots of money, sometimes almost penniless, before he comes back to Jefferson, or comes back to Mississippi. He gets off the train in Jefferson, he wanders his way to the property of Joanna Burden, and he takes up residence in one of the old African-American shacks on the property, and then he enters into a relationship with Joanna Burden. And he goes to work in the sawmill, which is where we saw him in chapter 2, at the very beginning, when Byron Bunch meets him and sees him for the first time. There are a couple of things here that I thought were significant, things to keep in mind. One is the idea, and I think Alan's probably going to talk about this and pick up on it too, but one is the idea of a rope. Joe uses a rope to escape from his attic bedroom every night to go into town to meet with Bobby and to have a sexual relationship with her. So that rope is a symbol of his rebellion. That rope is a symbol of his freedom. It is literally how he escapes from the McEachran's home. That has to have some symbolic value, that the rope leads to freedom. I think we'll find later on that rope leads to something else. And then the second idea that I think really starts to show up here in these chapters is the importance or the symbolism of open windows. So if you read chapter 1, you know that there's this whole thing where it takes Lena, months to realize she can open the window on the lean-to where her bedroom is located in the house of her brother or uncle, where she goes to live after her parents are killed, and that it's by escaping through that window that she meets with Lucas Birch and has sex with him and gets pregnant. And at one point she says, if I just kept that window closed, says something effective, if I just kept that window closed, I wouldn't have had any problems. Well, that open window idea comes back over and over again. For instance, Joe Christmas escapes using the rope, but through a window. And that rope leads him to freedom, but it also leads him to sex, as it did with Lena Grove, and it also leads him into trouble. Eventually, that escape and that rope and that freedom and going out that window leads him away from the McKecker, and so much so that he murders his adoptive father. And then later, when he moves to Jefferson and he takes up residence on the Burden place, he gains access to the house through a window in the kitchen. And this is when he meets Joanna Burden for the first time, and this is the doorway to his sexual relationship with her, or I should say the windowway or the passageway to his sexual relationship and his relationship with her, which, as we already know, since we know by the time we get to these chapters that Joanna Burden has been murdered and he's been accused of that murder, we also know that that leads him to trouble. So that, look for that open window and the importance of windows and access in and out of windows moving forward. Also, you might think, and I haven't thought my way all the way through this, but the former Reverend Hightower sits by a window and looks outside and watches the street, and he can hear church service and singing going on through that window. And the last thing I wanted to mention to you has to do with Joanna Burden's name and her relationship to racial issues in the South. So her last name is Burden, and you can't help but think of the old phrase, the white man's burden, that white people, Europeans, had an obligation to civilize and to lift up the rest of the world, and in this case to lift up African Americans. And certainly that's one of those things that Joanna Burden's family has been up to. Her grandfather was an abolitionist, a violent abolitionist of sorts. Her family moves to Mississippi to try to help African Americans gain their equality. 2 members of her family are murdered standing up for voting rights for African Americans, and they're murdered by, of all people, Colonel Sartoris, who is the main character in Faulkner's kind of collection of long short stories, which now is known as the novel The Unvanquished. And her family then has this history of attempting to lift up African Americans. As a matter of fact, Joanna's father essentially says something almost directly like that to her. God put on a whole race before your grandfather or your brother or me or you were even thought of, a race doomed and cursed to be forever and ever a part of the white race's doom and curse for its sins. Remember that, his doom and his curse forever and ever, mine, your mother's, yours even though you were a child, the curse of every white child that was ever born and that will ever be born. None can escape it. Later on the same page, the daughter, this is Joanne talking to her father, she said, "At last I told father. I tried to tell him. What I wanted to tell him was that I must escape, get away from under the shadow, or I would die. You cannot," he said. "You must struggle, rise. But in order to rise, you must raise the shadow with you." In this case, the shadow, from Joanna's father's point of view, is African American or African Americans. You must raise the shadow with you, but you can never lift it to your level. I see that now, which I did not see until I came down here. But escape it you cannot. The curse of the black race is God's curse, but the curse of the white race is the black man who will be forever God's chosen own because he once cursed him. So again, here is literally Faulkner kind of repeating the idea of the white man's burden through the voice of Joanna Burden and her father. The male-female relationship at the heart of the novel so far is actually the relationship between Joe Christmas and Joanna Burden. And what's interesting to me about that is that neither one of those people is accepted really fully in the society in which they live. Joe Christmas is not accepted or does not feel comfortable in African American society, and again that's reemphasized here, and he is not accepted in white society once they find out he is of mixed race. Joanna Burden is not accepted in Jefferson, and her family is disliked and somewhat hated because they play such a role in trying to help African Americans and to struggle against the racism and segregation of the South. And so I guess it's kind of natural, and perhaps they find themselves, their relationship is a troubled, somewhat violent one, but a sexual relationship in which is essentially both consent to, even though the first time they have sex, Joe reports that Joanna resisted, but that she resisted more like a man than a woman, which I think is interesting. Brings up the issue of, does Joe Christmas rape Joanna Bird? And I'd like to know what you guys think about that. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to mention is that Faulkner has, I think, the clearest statement he has about race and racism is in, I believe it's in chapter 11. Christmas, after hearing Joanna tell the story about how her grandfather and her half-brother were killed by Colonel Sartoris over this issue of voting rights, talks about how her father buried their bodies in secret because he was afraid their bodies would be dug up. And Joe Christmas, in hearing the story, says, "Oh," Christmas said, "they might have done that. Dug them up after they were already killed, dead? Just when do men that have different blood in them stop hating one another?" Well, that's a really good question, and a question we still have not fully resolved yet, but a question I think Faulkner was really interested in, and in some way is at the heart of this novel. Anyway, still having a great time reading Light in August. I hope you're enjoying it. I look forward to seeing all your videos and your comments in the comment section below. As always, thank you for watching.